I do mostly international trade law and development issues, and I've been working in international trade for sort of 20 plus years. And when I started, there aren't many women working in that field now, but there were very few then. But I was working in it because of the fundamental belief that trade brings around growth, and growth brings development, and it alleviates poverty, and trade is a good thing. Trade liberalisation is a good thing. However, when I started, it was totally gender neutral. No one talked about women, and it was just assumed that women would benefit in the same way that anybody would benefit from trade liberalisation. Now, things are changing a bit. And so I'm going to talk to you about the developments that have happened in trade agreements. Excuse me if I refer to my notes, but I sometimes forget. So basically the prevailing assumption, the baseline was that trade was gender neutral. Trade brings around what the objectives of the World Trade Organization and the GATT really is to create growth, which creates employment, which creates poverty reduction, income growth. So that the whole sort of thrust is to get people, business going and create employment that way. And there are some positive impacts that we can see over the last 30 years. For example, developing countries now constitute 48% of world trade. In 2000, it was only 33%. And the number of people living in extreme poverty has actually dropped. It's halved since 1990. And now just under 1 billion people live under $1.25 a day. So this directly relates to women's empowerment. Women are often in small businesses, and so that's what we thought, well, this is a good thing for women. However, now, what's happened in the last few years is that we realise that there are losers and winners from trade liberalisation, and we have to work on what the kind of like the impact of trade liberalisation. We have to mine down much deeper than just saying, okay, we've halved poverty in 20 years, and we need to actually work out where the impacts are. And a lot of the backlash from globalisation, has happened because there's been what we call labour churning. Some businesses, some sectors go out completely, become redundant, and others become much more sort of flourishing and expand. So we can say, okay, digital, we call it the gig economy. The gig economy I thought was about gigabytes. No, it's about people who work like a gig. You don't have a full-time job anymore, you're on demand, you're an Uber driver, or you do something like that. Well, there's work coming out on the gig economy that says actually the implications of the gig economy are not doing what we thought. We thought it was going to make things much better for women because technology, could work at home, do other things. Actually, the same traditional disparities and wage gaps are the same in the new gig economy. There's been some research on Uber, for example, and they find that women who are Uber drivers, they earn much less than men as Uber drivers. So why is that? Well, women are much less likely to drive dangerously and fast, so they don't do as much work because they're not going to speed around and take risks. And women aren't going to go into unsafe areas, so they're much more restricted in where they're going to go. But we didn't think about mining down and finding this information until quite recently. And a lot of it was to do with the backlash against globalisation. People being unemployed, say, for example, in the north of England, people who are made unemployed because of international trade coming and doing it much cheaper, for example, in another country. And then we find out that people who are displaced by globalisation, actually they become quite extreme voters, and so they're radicalised as well. So now actually we have to get our head around this, even if we don't want to, we have to, because the backlash is telling us that the gains from trade aren't evenly spread. So, what can we do? I think the big answer from the trade people like me is not to shut down trade. Protectionism is not the answer to gender disparities from trade liberalisation. The answer is to actually try and make it work for all marginalised people rather than shut it down. So, in my opinion, what Donald Trump's doing is not going to help women. Even though he might be thinking, well, globalisation is not helping women in parts of the Midwest of America. They're losing their jobs, they're working in manufacturing. Manufacturing is actually a declining industry, and women are predominantly in manufacturing. The answer is not to put tariffs and close down trade. Actually, it's to work out how you retrain and how you reskill people who actually, the changing job market requires different skills from people, and it's how you actually change the job market so that people have the skills that the jobs need. And it's not so easy. So in America there's a trade adjustment fund that they set up to help, Kennedy set it up actually. Kennedy set it up in the 60s. He said the people who gain from globalization should not be the only ones here. We should also help the people who don't gain from globalization. So we set up this fund, which seems like a fantastic thing to do. And when they did an assessment of it after 10 years and after 20 years, they found it had perverse results actually. People who actually went on the training programs from this trade adjustment fund were earning $500 less a year than people who didn't go on the training program. So what is going on there? Why are all the rocket scientists and brilliant people able to make things happen, but they can't make a trade adjustment fund happen? So what is it to do with the priorities or to do with allocation? We don't know enough about why these mechanisms don't work. They're set up to work and they don't actually target the people who need them. And if they do, they're not actually doing what we want them to do. So the solution is to actually find new ways of making sure that trade liberalisation benefits everybody and not just people who own stocks and shares or have the business themselves. It's getting to the point now where I stand up in a meeting talking about international trade and I'm thinking, actually, is this only benefiting the business elite of the world? What I thought was something to do with making the pie bigger so that everybody there was more to share around is not actually manifesting itself. So I'm sort of forced into a position where I was at one point thinking, well, actually, I'm an economic liberal. Now I'm becoming a Marxist again. I just think, actually, we're creating a two-tier society, the haves and have-nots, and international trade is actually sort of, in some way, it's cementing that haves and have-nots. It's not actually doing something which we thought create full employment, growth, income increases. It's not actually naturally happening. So we have to build mechanisms to make it happen. So what do we know? We know gendered impacts of trade liberalisation is sectorally very different. What happens in agriculture is very different from what happens in manufacturing, which is very different from what happens in services. So we can't even talk generally about what happens to trade liberalisation. We actually have to go, like we do, to the gig economy and work out what's happening with women there. So the theory is underdeveloped, and we don't have the empirics for it. Although there is some evidence that's emerging that says that women are constrained from moving into the more skilled, higher paying jobs that are created by trade liberalisation because of not so much access to education, not so much access to finance, and not so much time. It's as simple as that, not so much time. So we have to do more work, and it shouldn't just be women who are doing this work. This should be something that's just of general interest. We want to talk about what happens to marginalised people, and if women are predominantly marginalised people, why should it be only women who study what happens to women? So we do know something about women in manufacturing. There was a study in 2016 by a woman called Levinson, and she said, well, look, women account for a large share of employment, particularly in those industries which are declining the steepest, such as apparel, textiles, and electronic manufacturing. And she said the problem in America was that since 2009, there's been an upswing in US manufacturing, but it hasn't created any employment. And in fact, a 21% increase in output was accompanied by a 5% increase in employment. Particularly work opportunities were particularly bad for workers without skills, so sort of the less educated workers. And manufacturing wages have declined absolutely and relatively in many industries. Even worse, the proportion of female manufacturing workers has fallen 5%. 32% was their proportion in 1993, and it's now 27% in 2016. So women in manufacturing, actually, it's a myth. It's not doing us many favours, and that's supposed to be one of the sectors that women are predominantly working in. So what can trade agreements do for women? There is something in the WTO called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and this is about, digitalisation, the digital economy, and trying to make customs procedures much more digitalised and high-tech. And I was shocked. So this should have a positive impact on women, this trade agreement, and I'll tell you why. Because this is just one study, so I'm not pretending that this is a universal truth. But one study showed that women wait 37% longer on average than men to see the same customs official, and I can believe that. Also, this reduces their export, so the trade facilitation agreement should reduce their export costs because there'll be less time waiting to get your goods through. If your goods take longer to get through customs, it costs more to store them, which means that your wages are going to come down. So something like the trade facilitation agreement should theoretically help women. We need to do studies to see if it does. Let's think about labour standards, just general labour standards. In the WTO, they have, since the Singapore round in 1996, they've talked about labour standards from the ILO and how we have to incorporate labour standards. However, the WTO says we do not deal with the linkages between trade liberalisation and labour standards. That's for the ILO to deal with. So the WTO is, not only is it gender neutral, but it also doesn't really want to deal with labour standards. Obviously, in developing countries, they say our comparative advantage is low labour costs. So if you make us have these high standards that you do in Europe and North America, we're going to lose our comparative advantage and we're not going to be able to sell as much as we want to and we could. So is this just a ruse by developed countries to impose their standards on us so we can't trade? So there is a double argument going on with labour standards. But generally, we want to know that workers are safe in the workplace, that they have protections, they aren't discriminated against for various reasons. So there is a good reason to have labour provisions in a trade agreement. But the WTO at present will not deal with it because of various institutional and also political dynamics. So we look to free trade agreements. Now, free trade agreements can incorporate a lot more issues than the WTO can. They can have labour provisions, they can have environmental provisions, they can have gender provisions, they can look at SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, because they don't have the constraints that the WTO has. It's just between me and you, Canada and the EU, America and Mexico and Canada. So you can do much more. They're much more flexible, and it's between the parties. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened in free trade agreements. Now, the USMCA, this is the new NAFTA. This is Trump's baby. And the NAFTA actually it was a pioneer in having labour provisions, a whole chapter on labour, a side agreement on labour, in fact. So it seems like actually the USMCA has not really changed very much on the labour. They say each party shall adopt and maintain practices stated in the ILO Declaration and rights at work. So again, they outsource it to the ILO. Parties shall adopt and maintain practices governing acceptable conditions of work and respect to minimum wages, hours of work and occupational health and safety. And no discrimination against migrant workers, including non-national migrant workers. So you say, well, that's interesting now that they're actually incorporating the migrant angle. And no party shall fail to address cases of violence or threats of violence against workers. So it's in the free trade agreement, it seems quite good. However, when it comes to enforcement, there's a very high threshold. It has to be either a sustained or recurring course of action or inaction on one of the parties, and it has to be in a manner that affects the trade under the trade agreement. So I can't just come to you, say for example, I think you have terrible labour standards and we've got a free trade agreement. I can't come to you and say, listen, I don't think that you allow collective organisation of labour in your workplace in your country. I can't say that. I have to prove that your inaction has caused a detrimental effect on the trade that we're having between us. Now that's a pretty high threshold if you think about it, and getting the evidence. Especially sometimes there's a bit of a myth about what these trade agreements actually cover. So an economist friend of mine has done some work on the UK and Canada and what they trade under the CETA, which is the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU. And it seems like 70% of the trade between Canada and the UK is gold. There's not much going on. So we can talk about these provisions and how wonderfully elaborate they are, but actually if there's not much trade going on between the parties, it's kind of smoke and mirrors. Those labour provisions are kind of window dressing. So that was the main part of this new USMCA. However, what was a complete break with the past is they have an article called Gender Protection on Sex-Based Discrimination in the Workplace. And this was a victory for the Canadian negotiators. This was a Trudeau, kind of a baby of Trudeau. And this is really novel. It says, parties recognise the goal of eliminating sex-based discrimination in employment and occupation, promoting equality of women in the workplace, protecting workers against employment discrimination on the basis of sex, on the basis of pregnancy, on sexual harassment, sexual orientation, gender identity, caregiving responsibilities, provide job-protected leave for birth or adoption of child and care of family members, and protection against wage discrimination. So this is a massively different set of issues to any other trade agreement before. And I was thinking, wow, something is really changing. This initiative by the Canadians has actually got into both Mexico and America. However, as soon as Congress saw that, Congress said, no, this elevates sexual orientation and gender identity to a very high level. And what it does is it circumvents the proper legislative process for the redefinition of sex, and that conflicts with existing laws, precedent and religious liberty and conscious rights. So they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to add a footnote. And so the US added a footnote that said that what they had in place at the moment in the US, which is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is sufficient to fill all obligations. And to be clear, this agreement does not demand any changes from the US. So they neutralized what was a very progressive, because it was more about LGBT, but it's neutralized everything. So we can say, well, we had this turning point and then we had the backlash, and this is what happens. Most of these trade agreements, in fact, all of these trade agreements at a regional level are based on domestic enforcement. You cannot go into another country and try and enforce a labour law. It has to be that government determines its level of labour standards or gender protection or women's rights, and they enforce it. If you have a problem, you go to consultation, and maybe you'll have it in the American ones. There is a possibility for having a dispute over a labour issue. But in the EU ones, no, they like consultation and cooperation and good offices. They don't like the enforcement mechanism. So actually, it's all about what your government does. So you can't expect a trade agreement to actually force your government to do anything. If your government doesn't want to give protections, then it doesn't have to because it's domestic enforcement. So let's have a look at what goes on in the EU-Canada agreement. Well, they have the sort of basic template that endorses the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and its follow-up, the ILO Decent Work Agenda, the ILO Declaration on Social Justice for a Fair Globalization, and they also have a non-discrimination clause about migrant workers and non-national migrant workers. And they have a labour contact point, but if you have any problems, you have to go to another chapter in the agreement, which is the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, and that oversees it, and they oversee the consultations. So actually it's quite weak. It looks quite good on paper, but it's domestic enforcement, referencing international conventions, and there's no dispute settlement mechanism. And you think, well, Canada, you're so progressive about this, why? So an afterthought from Canada. So the negotiations from CETA started, I don't know, maybe 2012, 2013. It was ratified 2017. In 2018, the Joint Committee came out with a recommendation on trade and gender. And they said, the CETA Joint Committee recommends that the parties cooperate to improve the capacity and conditions for women, including workers, businesswomen and entrepreneurs, to access and fully benefit from the opportunities created by the CETA. But it's only about cooperation activities, although such cooperation activities should be carried out with the inclusive participation of women. So Canada, the more progressive party here, didn't put gender in the original CETA agreement, but came out with this recommendation letter, which actually doesn't mean much more than what the parties want it to mean. If the parties don't want to cooperate on a gender issue or a women's issue, they don't have to. No one's forcing them to. The parties have to determine the topics. So again, it's back to us petitioning our governments to do something about discrimination. But what I thought was more interesting was Chile. So Chile has signed 2 agreements with the whole trade and gender chapter. And Trade and Gender chapter is different from the others. The general provisions acknowledge the importance of incorporating a gender perspective into the promotion of inclusive economic growth, affirm their commitment to adopt, maintain and implement effectively their gender equality laws, regulations and policies, and reaffirms commitment to effectively implement CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is the first time I've seen CEDAW in one of these agreements. So actually Chile has gone further than the US and Canada and is incorporating that into its trade agreements with Canada and Argentina. But it is based on cooperation. They have a trade and gender committee, but you're not allowed to use a dispute settlement that covers the trade agreement for this gender and trade chapter. So again, it kind of neutralizes the force, the implementation of it, because it's not. However, what is interesting is the studies that have been done on the impact of labour provisions. They say that the ones with cooperation rather than the enforcement mechanism, so the EU model rather than the US model, is actually more effective. Somehow, if we talk together about problems, it works much better than if I try and beat you with a stick. And also the fact is that very high threshold for a breach, you have to prove that your discrimination is sustained and it's affected the trade between us. So in the case of UK and Canada, if the trade is only about gold, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to prove anything is attributed to that trade. So it is a bit smoke and mirrors. However, on the other hand, there has been some research that says that actually introducing labour provisions has no impact on trade either. So we're sort of thinking, well, it has no impact on trade and it has no impact on labour. What are we doing here? So, by way of conclusion, is it window dressing? Is it some way of trying to incorporate provisions on issues that are worrying civil society, worrying people that aren't necessarily profiting from the business aspect of it? So the environment and the labour and the gender provisions are all fairly soft. They're all based on domestic standards. And it's all based on either you have a very high threshold for the breach or it's based on cooperation. Is it window dressing? And I think about this quite a lot because I work also on the environmental provisions. And I was thinking, well, you know, maybe what's happening is norming. Maybe we're just going to have this international network of norms for not just gender, but for environment and for labour. And then that actually pulls our expectations up of what is normal. And maybe all trade agreements are doing are reflecting the changing norms in society. They're not going any further, they're not forcing any more, but they're keeping in pace with them. So I think, on balance, you can't say that they're a bad thing. Okay, maybe they're not doing anything, but they are reflecting the fact that society now cares about these issues enough to put them in a trade agreement, and enough to have maybe a committee on trade agreement. But for me, the real issue is about how we don't have the evidence. People aren't sort of drilling down when they're doing impact assessments or looking at what trade liberalisation is doing. They're not drilling down deep enough to work out really what the impacts are, the implications are on a gender level or on marginalised people. So what we really need to do is make sure that more of that gender research is undertaken and it's got good data. And then you've got something to actually present to these trade and labour and gender committees. And when there's an impact assessment in the European Union, whenever there's a major regulation or started off with sustainability, they have to have an impact assessment of the regulation ex ante. They have to say, what is the objective of this regulation? How is it going to meet this regulation? Is it reasonable? Is it achievable? And how do we monitor this? Now, if they're going to do that, and there's a gender provision in there, then what you want is for someone to actually say, okay, well, I'm going to look at how this gig economy is actually affecting women. I want to see if it's actually just replicating the gender inequalities and wage that we already have. I want to see what it's like for women who are trying to do this piecemeal work and juggle and not have a social security net, because part of the gig economy is that the employers don't have to pay the unemployment benefits and the sickness benefits and other things. So we have to really find out how it's impacting and have the numbers. And then if you have the numbers, then you can do something with the numbers, because you can say to the Trade and Gender Committee, listen, this is a problem. We've seen that women's salaries, women's wages have fallen 12% in this sector. What are we going to do about it? We've seen that the jobs that are being created by this trade agreement require these skills. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to get people, women, to have those skills so they can actually do the jobs that this trade agreement is creating? Because actually it also destroys a lot of jobs. So for me, it's about going out there and making sure the data is there. And it's starting, and so this research that I looked at on the gig economy was really quite good. It sort of divided it up into on-demand gig economy work and customised gig economy work, which is for higher skilled people. We need to break it all down, disaggregate it, and get the numbers, and then we can go to policymakers and say, do you know that women's work has dropped 12%, and that has caused this much in terms of poverty, and that's impacting on the household, and that's impacting on women's ability to do other things. And it should be normal, instead of being like a side issue. 50% of the population, why should it be ignored? But it's not just women, it's also a class thing, it's also a race thing, but all this data needs to be produced. And who is it produced by? Well, people like us. So we have to do it, and we have to do it thoroughly, so it's convincing, and we can use it in policy making. If the information isn't there, then policy making doesn't have to take it on board. So it is really about having a persuasive case, because people have been talking about women's rights and feminism for a long time. We actually need to have more ammunition than just saying we have a right. We have to say, well, this is exactly where we need work, and this is exactly where we need to be training, or scholarships, or healthcare, or child support, or just, nursery places. So it's part of a bigger picture, and I think trade agreements are reflecting the fact that this is becoming normal, and people aren't going to sort of like say, okay, well, this is just another sort of like agenda thing. People were saying that about the environment 20 years ago. There's no way people can ignore the environment now. And I think it's the same with gender. So if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you.